There's much to talk about with our panel, so let's get right to it. Joining us from Buenos Aires is the news editor at the Buenos Aires Herald, James Grainger. With us here in Washington is Cynthia Arnson. She's the director of the Latin American program at the Wilson International Center for Scholars. Cristina Escobar is a Cuban journalist and commentator. She joins us from Havana, and with us from New York is Ambassador Arturo Sarukhan, a Mexican diplomat. For more than 20 years, he served as his country's ambassador to the United States from 2007 to 2013. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ambassador Sarukhan, let me start with you. What did you make of the president's visit? We saw a lot of symbolism in it, but did both sides get what they wanted?
Well, look, as in most diplomatic events, you need, in this case, two to salsa. I think both the United States and Cuba are betting long. It's not going to happen quickly. There will be a process, I think, which will hopefully build the momentum and the constituencies, both in Cuba and in the United States, that start betting in favor of the normalization of relations and the slow process of rebuilding a relationship that was one of the most poisonous and toxic bilateral relationships in the America.
Cristina, some of the Cubans I've spoken to about this visit say it was a good first step, but they're reserving judgment on what this could mean for the future. What are ordinary Cubans saying about this? How are they looking at this visit?
Well, Obama has had a very warm welcome here in Cuba, but of course there's a lot of questions about the future and what could this mean for the Cubans and for the Cuban people and for the future of Cuba. And even though the president has shown himself as a friend of Cubans, those words he mentioned this morning in the speech in the theater in Havana this morning, even though that we are very clear that the embargo is still in place, that Obama has only 10 months in the White House, and that could rapidly change after the next president. And that the President Obama, even though has shown much more understanding of the reality of Cuba and much more respect to the Cuban government and to the Cuban institutions, is still following a very clear path towards positioning things like human rights, what I would like to call better political rights, where that's exactly what he addressed and he means when he talks about human rights in Cuba. Very centered on that, much more, I would say, than in any other country of the world, even though Cuba doesn't have those records that below of any other country of Latin America. I think that all of that raises questions in Cuba about how much honesty can we expect from the words of the President Barack Obama, but in any case, it's been a good visit, and people in Cuba are very happy because they feel that it's an acknowledgement of our society, of our country, of our government, and taking into consideration our history. Only that is enough.
James, we are about to see the second part of President Obama's visit, his outreach to Latin America, if you like. This is the visit to Argentina. He's expected to land there in a short while. Why is this visit so important to Argentina? What is its significance?
Well, you mentioned before, your reporter mentioned before about the change in the government, and that's a very big thing, obviously. Last week, Obama spoke and called the previous president anti-American in her stance. And President Mauricio Macri, when he took office, talked about returning to the world. Now, that meant two things. One, securing a deal with the holdout creditors, which relates to the debt that's been long-standing in Argentina and a long problem with international markets. And the second thing would be to do with human rights. Obama is coming on a very sensitive date for a lot of people here. And I would perhaps argue that the White House didn't exactly do its research. Initially, there was a disagreement about whether Obama would attend an event on the 24th, which really quite infuriated some human rights groups. But since then, he's decided to go and made a major announcement in terms of opening up some of the records that have been hidden from many of the human rights organizations, like the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo. These documents could really allow people to find out the truth about what happened to some of the 30,000 people that disappeared under the military dictatorship, and also allow some of those people that lost their children and their grandchildren to really discover their identities. So, I mean, there's twofolds. It's business and human rights, and both these things will really have a huge impact here in the country.
Cynthia, when we look at this visit by President Obama, it will be seen as very significant, isn't it? He's basically changed decades of U.S. policy towards Cuba and to some extent towards Latin America as well. What did you make of it?
Well, this is certainly the capstone of his Latin American policy. This is not the first trip by any means that he's taken to the region. He's visited Brazil and Chile and El Salvador. And I think Argentina was actually quite miffed when he went to Chile in 2011 and pointedly did not go to Buenos Aires. He's also attended a number of regional summits in Cartagena, in Trinidad and Tobago, where he has met in the region with a number of leaders. But I think this is the opening of diplomatic relations with Cuba is by far the boldest step that he has taken to really change the conversation about U.S. Latin American relations. As you pointed out and as others have said, it was a longtime irritant in U.S. relations with other countries of the hemisphere. They simply did not accept that U.S. policy would remain frozen in the past in the way it has.
Right, and to what extent does the visit to Cuba pave the way for better relations with the region as a whole?
I think the normalization that was announced back in December of 2014 has been widely applauded throughout the region, and this visit will obviously be seen as historic, that he did not only send his aides and his people in the State Department and the White House to go and negotiate bilaterally with the Cuban government, but that he himself took this bold step, of visiting the island and of reaching out directly to address the Cuban people. So I think that it will be an important part of his legacy, and as others have said, has taken away a very important irritant in the entire hemispheric relationship.
Right, Ambassador Sarukhan, as we're aware, this is one of the last big foreign policy initiatives on the part of the Obama administration. The president's term has only got about 10 months to run. I want to read you something which Peter Hakeem, the president emeritus of the Inter-American Dialogue, said recently. He said that aside from the new relationship with Cuba, Obama's investment and accomplishments in the region have been modest. The Latin America, aside from immigration issues, has hardly been mentioned in the U.S. presidential campaign, and that suggests that its priority is unlikely to rise much in the coming period. Do you agree with that?
Well, I've always said that trying to use presidential elections and campaigns as a benchmark of the relevance or priority of issues is probably the wrong benchmark. In many ways, Mexico in particular is at the top of that agenda because of the demagoguery and xenophobia of Donald Trump, and that isn't a good thing. One would prefer to have a completely different discussion regarding Mexico, immigration, and even trade in the Americas. So I think the president has certainly spent important political capital with certain countries in the region. I think this, as Cynthia says, is the capstone of how he wants to reframe the way the United States engages with the region. There have been three issues historically through which Latin America sees the United States and engages with the United States: drugs, immigration, and Cuba. One of those issues has now been put off the table because of this historic trip. The issue of how you confront drugs and the issue of how you reform immigration in the United States are still on the table, and because of what is happening in the campaign, will probably be kicked down the road until we have a new administration in Washington.
All right, Cristina, while the president was in Cuba, he declared what he called a new beginning, an open day in the relationship with Cuba. Does Cuba see it that way as well, or is there still mistrust between these two countries? I mean, you mentioned some of the obstacles that remain, things like Guantanamo, the blockade that's still in place, questions about human rights. How does Cuba see it the same way?
Well, I think there are a lot of obstacles still in the way, and I think that the speech of the President Obama is still a very exceptional discourse in the scenario of the American politics. There are not a lot of politicians like him that would say the things that he said here. Actually, Paul Ryan was just saying these days that Cuba is a nest for terrorism. Can you imagine saying that? So still in these days that we're living. So what I'm trying to say is that the Cold War speech is not dead inside the U.S. So the president can say a lot of things here, but actually he has a lot of opposition inside the U.S. about his policy. There are a lot of, I would say, obstacles in the way. It's not impossible to tackle them, to deal with them, but I think it depends on the political will of the next president of the United States. There's the Guantanamo issue, which is still a thing. There's the migration policy, and the previous panelist was talking about the things that Obama had as a priority in Latin America. He was talking about drugs. Cuba is the only country of the region that actually controls drugs trafficking in our coasts, and then also the immigration issue. Cuba has a deal with that, taking into consideration that we have the Cuban Adjustment Act, which is a legislation that allows the Cubans that just put a foot on American soil, they have privileges that any other citizen of the world has, which is a promotion to immigration towards the U.S. When you deport thousands of Latin Americans every day, Cubans are very welcome to enter the U.S., by the way, illegally, because getting a visa in the U.S. Embassy is practically impossible here nowadays. So that's going to be an issue, the Cuban Adjustment Act. And of course, the blockade. There's some things that are a prerogative of the president. He's changed some things, but still they're in contradiction with the very complex system of sanctions that are codified in the Helms-Burton Act that was passed in 1996. That's up to the Congress. And of course, as everything has been because of the President Obama, the next president could change that. That's why he's trying to give some freedoms that the Americans did not have previously, like coming to Cuba, like receiving cruises here, giving licenses for that, allowing more American companies to have business here in Cuba. So it could be harder for the next president to actually say to all those people, you can't do that just because I don't want. So it's a way of opening this, but I would say there are a lot of obstacles, and there are a lot of people that are still trying to find more obstacles to these dialogues. The claims issue is quite is part of the dialogue, of course. There are going to be a lot of challenges. I think it depends on the political will. And I think the Cuban government has demonstrated with this visit that has a lot of willingness of hearing pretty much anything, because Obama pointed out a lot of very controversial issues here in Havana.
Okay, Cynthia, you want to say something?
Sure. I wanted to just jump in and say that I disagree that the accomplishments have been relatively modest. I would certainly not make the argument that the immigration policy has been a success, anything but that. But I think that the president, it's just no longer possible to think of U.S. Latin American policy as a single entity. There are too many differences between countries, between subregions, and I think the Obama administration has actually done quite well in dealing with Mexico, in dealing with Central America, and improving, getting through a very budget-conscious Congress of a significant aid package to address root causes of violence and create opportunity. I think that there has been a hand of friendship extended to Brazil based on, during a very difficult time in its history. There have been trade agreements that were not necessarily the ones that candidate Obama had wanted. He has been a staunch supporter of the peace process in Colombia and has extended a great deal of political support, to that process. So I think that it's no longer the case that you can look for these sweeping initiatives like the Alliance for Progress or whatever, because the region is simply too diverse. The nature of the U.S. relationship with particular countries is too important to be lumped together. The Cuba policy is a reflection of that, and I think that there has been an important recognition of the diversity of Latin America and also the importance of their insertion with other powers, including China, and recognizing that the United States still has an important role to play. So I disagree with the early formulation.
Okay, well, let me go to the visit to Argentina. Let me go back to James. James, Argentina has faced major economic challenges under Cristina Kirchner. Now, the new president is trying to steady that ship. To what extent will this visit by President Obama help him? Is this visit being seen essentially as an expression of confidence in Argentina after years in the economic wilderness?
Yes, very much so. I think, as I mentioned slightly earlier before, the holdouts battle was a major issue and affected Argentina's access to international credit markets. Now, one of the major things that's coming with the president is hundreds of businessmen with him. And tomorrow, in an event at La Rural, one of the exhibition grounds here, will be hundreds of businessmen who will be looking to try and seal deals with the respective parts of the governments. Under Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, we had protectionism for lemons, maybe beef, some of the major exports of Argentina, and all indications that those things are going to open up very rapidly. Just going back to the previous point with the previous guest, I very much agree with the issue about diversity in Latin America, and I think that's one thing that's really key. One thing that's been illustrated here is the difference in the attitudes between the two governments. And yes, very much I see Obama's visit as a big vote of confidence for Mauricio Macri, who in his first days in office went straight to Davos, went straight to these international groups, and has hosted as many international leaders as possible. His focus is on the economy, and he thinks if he can get that running, then he will benefit politically.
Ambassador, the relationship with Brazil, Cynthia mentioned that a moment ago. This is a country that has had a close relationship with the United States. Of course, it nosedived after Brazil discovered that the National Security Agency here in the United States was spying on President Dilma Rousseff, was actually listening to her telephone calls. Where does that relationship stand right now?
Well, I think it's improved in important ways after the NSA revelations. I think there's been a concerted effort on both ends of that relationship to improve a bilateral nexus that is critically important in the Americas. But obviously the domestic political events that are unfolding in Brazil today mean that a government that would have in normal circumstances a much wider bandwidth to be able to deal with either the US or other pressing regional or global issues is concentrated on a very complex political dynamic.
Cristina, how significant was President Obama's declaration in Cuba that Cuba's future will be determined by Cubans? Is this, in many respects, do you see it as a marked change from previous U.S. policy and from previous U.S. administrations? I mean, in some instances, U.S. presidents have tried to overthrow leaders in Cuba, have tried to assassinate them. So how important was that, that statement that he made, that this has to be worked out by Cubans?
No, it's a big change. It's a moment in which we're seeing, this is not, saying that historic is not just a word that we journalists invent to make news. It's actually historic to listen to a president like Obama talking openly to the Cuban president about what he thinks, at least what he wants to address to the Cuban people. And I think this visit has erased, or at least gives another perspective on a lot of stereotypes about Cuba. And what Obama's been saying, that the future of Cuba depends on the Cubans, is something that the Cuban government have been saying a lot of time in order to ask to the American government not to interfere in the Cuban issues, which is something that has happened a lot. And of course, seeing a dialogue, just the private dialogue between the two presidents lasted for around 2 hours. That's a lot. A lot of talking, a lot of issues were dealt with there, and I think, of course, it's a major change. It's idea, and by the way, there's a lot about Obama, and I think there's a lot about to talk about Raúl Castro as a leader, as a person able to talk with someone that, of course, he does not agree in everything that he says. I think it's quite important. The declarations that he made today are, some people, I've talked to some people, and some people were not that happy with the fact that the President Obama did not address about how much determined Cuba has been by the policy of blockade or embargo, how much the Cuban economy has been affected by that, and the Cubans have been affected by that. And there's a wide consensus in Cuba, even though they might agree or not with the Cuban government, there's a wide consensus in that fact that the blockade is quite important. And the President Obama did not talk about that. He just talked, let's forget the history, let's forget the past, and just move along. It's not that easy, because forgetting the history gives you the risk of committing the same mistakes of the past. So you have to be able to take account, to take into consideration the history in order to move to the future. It's something that a lot of people were talking about today, but of course the speech of the president was broadcasted for the entire country. Openly, he talked to the Cuban people. He was able to do it. He was able to dialogue with the Cuban people, something he asked for several times, and he had the opportunity to do it.
Right, Cynthia, let's look at some of the other countries in Latin America with which the United States has had a very difficult relationship. Venezuela, for one. Last year, in an interview, you said to the BBC that the United States has a desire, wants to take, as you put it, take some of the venom out of the relationship. How's that gone?
Well, I think it went very poorly about a year ago when the U.S. government declared sanctions against Venezuela, and because of the way U.S. law is written, used language that declared Venezuela a national security threat to the United States, right, which of course was a very unfortunate turn of phrase. The White House immediately backtracked and I think did not see it coming, the extent to which that would be repudiated by countries around the hemisphere, but also be used by the Venezuelan government itself to cast the U.S. government as a threat to its existence. I think there has been very little that the United States could do to influence the political situation or the economic situation in Venezuela in a positive direction. And simply by staying out of the way and not making itself the issue, I think that also has been a big contribution. There has been a tendency and a commitment, on the part of the Obama administration to work multilaterally, to work with other countries, with Chile, with now Argentina, with Brazil, that also are concerned, with Colombia, are concerned about the potential for an implosion of some kind, the country is already an economic and humanitarian and political disaster, and to try to overcome some of the polarization. And I think that they've done that in an intelligent way that has avoided making themselves the issue.
Okay, and Ambassador, let's look at the relationship with Mexico. You were the top Mexican diplomat to the United States for many years. Over the past few months, we've been hearing very derogatory statements and comments and insults about Mexico and Mexicans during this U.S. presidential campaign season. But, these countries are close economic allies. It's the third biggest trading partner for the United States. So how would you characterize the relationship right now?
Well, I think fortunately this is a relationship that, because of NAFTA, because of the security relationship that was triggered as a result of 9/11, is stronger than the flatulence of Donald Trump, and it would take much more than that to derail a relationship that is so institutionalized. Now, having said that, of course, the tone of the GOP campaign is going to leave scars regardless of who wins in November. He has talked about Mexican migrants in a way that is extremely derogatory and xenophobic. The media and public opinion in Mexico have obviously latched onto this discourse and have rejected it. And the problem at the end of the day is that he is a fact-free walking zone by ignoring the critically important two-way trade between Mexico and the United States. When he talks about slapping tariffs on Mexican exports to the United States, he hasn't realized that of every dollar that Mexico exports to the United States, 42 cents are of U.S. products. So it would be a known goal that Trump would score if he were to try and trigger a trade war with the United States. So the problem, again, is an individual who is saying something either false or misleading every 5 minutes on average.